Our next section, we're going to talk about general preferences. This is the section where you're going to maximize how Photoshop performs and for your workflow. So now let's get into it. We'll go under Photoshop, Preferences, and General. If you're using a PC, it should be under Edit, Preferences. Now, the first part is the tab here which says General. Since Photoshop is used by graphic designers, photographers, and many different trades, we're not going to cover every single thing, just the parts that are relative to us. The first being image interpolation. Now, what image interpolation is basically whenever you resize an image in Photoshop, it changes how sharp or if it adds any filters to it. For instance, let's say that I have a full res image and I want to scale it down to a web size image. What happens is by default, Photoshop is going to actually apply a little bit of sharpening to it, which can add a little bit of artifacting and grain that we may not want as a favorable result. So to turn that off, I preferably like using bicubic smoother. And the reason for that is when I resize down for the web, it doesn't add that sharpening that I don't like as much. Now they all give a little bit of a different look just depending on what you're going for, so experiment with it and see that you have a setting that's best for you. For me, as I mentioned, I keep it to bicubic smoother. The other thing that I turn off by default is right here where it says Show Start Workspace when no documents are open. This is that screen that you saw initially where it allows you to open up new documents or open up existing files on your computer. So we'll turn that off by default for now so that anytime we open up something new, it'll look identical to any version of Photoshop that you might have. And that's pretty much it for this screen, at least for what we're doing. Now we'll go on to interface. This is something that people wonder about because Photoshop before, in earlier versions, had a different look. It wasn't dark. They never had a dark appearance. They had either a light gray appearance by default, and these darker views came later. Personally, I prefer just keeping it to the neutral gray for now, especially if you have no intention of changing it. But if you say, for example, are used to an older version, keeping it to a light gray to make it easier on your eyes may be something that you want to try out as well. Let's see. Now, the other aspect that I want to talk about primarily seems to be all the way down here on tools. We don't have anything on workspace that I recommend playing around with. But with tools, the one thing that I do want to turn off is enable flick panning. What enable flick panning is anytime you move a document around in Photoshop, it tends to glide, which I'm going to show you later on. But that just takes up a lot of graphical power. So I'll turn that off, and I'll also turn animated zoom off. And again, that's just a graphical effect, is whenever you zoom into an image or into a document, it starts making this graphical change, and it takes up a lot of power that's unnecessary for you to actually be using Photoshop. It makes it quicker when you turn these settings off. The next part is file handling. This is a very important section because by default, what happens is Photoshop will save recovery information in the background every few minutes. Instead of 10 minutes, we're going to set it to 5 minutes. This feature is only available in most current versions of Photoshop. So if you're using, say, CS5 or before, you might not have it. So keep that in mind. It's just something else that comes with newer versions of Photoshop. So instead of 10 minutes, we'll go save it as 5. So in case Photoshop crashes or you have a power outage, what happens is when you start the computer back up or you start Photoshop back up, you'll get a recovered document, which is nice. Especially if you've been working for a few hours and you forgot to save, it really comes in handy. This won't come in handy if you accidentally close a document and you don't save it, then you're kind of out of luck. So for emergency situations, it's quite nice. Aside from that, there's nothing else here that seems to be quite relevant. We'll go to Performance. Now this is my favorite tab because if you're working on a laptop or if you are on the go and you want to maximize performance, this is the place to do it. The first thing that I like doing is this setting here by default seems to be around 70%, which is clearly not large enough. So we're going to bring it all the way up to say 90, 95. What this setting does is it basically allows you to use the most amount of RAM your computer has in Photoshop. And so if you don't have other programs open, this lets you quickens your workflow when you have images open or you're retouching or you're saving. It just exponentially makes things much faster than what they are by default. The next part right here is the graphics processor setting. Make sure that you have graphics processor checked. Photoshop tends to be very heavy on graphics power, so being able to make sure that you have all these checkboxes here under advanced settings enabled will be to your advantage. Now, depending on your graphics card or if you're working on a laptop or a Mac or a PC, these settings will all be different, so don't worry about that. Just make sure that they're all set to advanced and you have your checkboxes checked. The next part is down here where it says history states. Now history states is something where, let's say you're working in Photoshop or you're drawing and you do 50 different brush strokes. Say you want to go back in steps in your history. History states are just that. You're able to go backwards in time, 50 steps in the past. But the downside is in the background, it's storing all this information, so Photoshop tends to get a little bit more clunky. I preferably like to keep it at, say, 20. You can even highlight the number, change it, or you can use a drop-down menu and use a slider. I think 20 is enough of a fail-safe, so in case you mess up, you can still have a little bit of a safety net. However, we also have different things that we're going to talk about, like layers, which allow you to go back at any time, no matter what position you are in your workflow, which makes history states, like a secondary backup. Now, the next thing is cache levels. What cache levels are kind of like the amount of information Photoshop is storing in the background for your image. So say you have a really big image open and you don't want it to load every single time you zoom in or you zoom out. Photoshop gives you more space to actually save this information, so it loads much quicker. I preferably like to leave it between 6 to 8. And the reason for that is I think when you maximize it at 8, it kind of becomes a little bit unstable. They may have updated this and it may have become stable, but for now I keep it to 6. Cache tile size is the same way. I like to keep it either 1028 or 1024, just depending on if you're used to using a PC or a Mac, so this changes. By default, it comes to 1024, so I'll keep it there for now. The next section is scratch disks. Now, what this is say that you don't have a lot of RAM or you don't have a lot of memory and Photoshop is working much slower than you want it to. The quickest upgrade that I found personally is having a scratch disk. So for instance, let's say you have an external hard drive or a second hard drive on your computer. You can plug it in to your laptop or your computer and it's going to show up here as an additional scratch disk to use. So if you enable that, what that's going to do is any additional memory or information that you're using in Photoshop is going to get stored in this separate disk so that can access the files quicker and the information, which ultimately speeds up your workflow. So the main takeaway there is if you have another hard drive or if your computer is working slow, ultimately you want something like a solid state drive versus a spinning disk drive if you're familiar with that concept. You can plug that in and enable that, and it'll quicken up how fast your files will load in Photoshop as you're working. Now, if Photoshop is already working fast enough, then it may not be necessary to tamper with this. So I guess it's another backup solution in case you want to optimize Photoshop even further. Now, I think everything else for our purposes is not very useful. For example, cursors. I keep it to the standard size, which is a normal brush tip. I don't change it to the full-size brush tip because what happens is this full-size brush tip here seems to be not on par with the actual brush size that you're using in Photoshop. So, for example, if you have a really soft brush that we're going to talk about coming up, it tends to compensate and show the entire range of how soft the brush is. This normal brush tip here shows you the exact size your actual brush is. So the main takeaway there is keep it default. We don't need to mess with any of these settings. Same goes for these cursors here. They're just things to consider, but nothing that we need going forward. The same thing here with units, rulers, plugins, types, 3D. None of that is something that we need in Photoshop, especially 3D. The reason why these things are here is, as I mentioned, if you're a 3D artist or if you like working with type and calligraphy or anything that relates to being creative, Photoshop is an avenue for that. So like I said, keep all that standard. If we ever need to mess with anything, we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it for a specific purpose. The one thing that I do want to mention, if you are somebody who likes to publish things to the web, or if you're printing things to a book, and you want to change from, say, the size of your canvas from pixels to inches, under units and rulers, you'll see something here which has a drop-down menu. And instead of inches, you can select pixels. By default, I like to leave this as inches. And the reason for that is anytime I'm trying to print something and I want to see exactly how big this document is when we print it out, it gives you an exact idea of how large that is. Now, if you work in, say, centimeters or millimeters, you can do that too. So it makes it pretty versatile in how you lay out your images when they're ready for print or the web. And once you have all your settings done, all you need to do is hit OK. They save automatically, so there's no Save As button or Save function. And I'll hit OK and exit that. The one thing to note is, unfortunately with preferences, you can't really save everything to begin with, so you do have to go back and change it anytime you want to change something, unlike the palettes where you can just customize your workspace by going here and accessing the workspace you want to work with. So if you want to change anything, all you need to do is go back under Photoshop, Preferences, or on the PC, which is Edit, Preferences, and go under General and change the interface that you want to be working with. So keep that in mind anytime you update Photoshop. It's going to carry that over, but if you work on a new system, for example, you need to go back and change the preferences that you are comfortable with. In case you ever want to reset your preferences, say you messed up something or Photoshop starts acting glitchy, there's an easy way to do that, fortunately. Under your Preferences and General, there is a button here which says Reset Preferences on Quit. I'm not going to hit that right now. However, if you do and you hit OK, all you need to do is restart Photoshop again, and it's going to reset all your preferences. Now, as a quick reminder, everything we just set up right now will go away if you do enable a reset. So only do that in a situation where you need to do so. So in this section, we talked about how we can optimize Photoshop to make the most use of our system when working with images going forward. Now, the next section we're going to talk about is actually opening up documents, getting familiar with different tools, and just the navigation part about Photoshop.